Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Centre for Geopolitics. My name is Brendan Sims. I'm the director of the Centre. I'm also the co-director with Ali Ansari here and Sir John Jenkins, who is online, of the Westphalia for the Middle East project at the Centre for Geopolitics. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Brad Faught, who is Professor of History at Tyndale College at Toronto. He is the author of many fine works, in particular on Lord Kitchener, but also, of course, most recently, his new book on the 1921 Cairo Conference. So the sequence is that Brad will deliver his remarks, then we will have some discussion between him and Sir John Jenkins, who is, as I say, online, and then subsequently Ali Ansari of the University of St Andrews, and a noted expert on Iran, will chair the discussion. Sir John Jenkins, I think you all know, noted Arabist, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, many other Arab countries. So with that, and without any more ado, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Sims. It's really wonderful to be here. Came over from Toronto just a few days ago, so I'm well past jet lag, and now I have water, so all is well. I know there's some people watching online, both here and further afield, so happy that they're with us too. This talk has taken some doing in terms of scheduling because Sir John is one of the last great globetrotters in the world. So I'm here and he is elsewhere, but we finally were able to put a date together. What I want to do by way of introduction, because I know Sir John has talked to me about this being more of a moderated conversation than a talk, but I will offer a few things off the top, and then Sir John will join us in terms of questions and conversation and a certain amount of probing. The book that you can see there makes an attempt to probe, in a sense, the official mind. Now that, for some imperial historians of a bygone age, will conjure up maybe not such pleasant memories. But nonetheless, what I've tried to do when I got down to business on this book is to really figure out what people were thinking. What were the motivations behind the conference? What were the motivations in terms of the different actors? And in doing that, and Churchill is the main actor, but the more I probed the book, the more I discovered that Churchill was not alone in this. There were several others, particularly Lawrence, Gertrude Bell, and some others who had coming out of the war developed a certain idea about how the post-Ottoman Middle East should be reconstructed. And I think when Sir John starts to ask some questions, we'll get further into that. So as I began to probe the archives and probe the literature, one of the things that I discovered was that the Cairo Conference itself, not how it was portrayed later, but the actual nuts and bolts of the 10 days they spent in Cairo, had never really been that closely examined. So I went back to the documents and I started trolling through them, and the letters, and the cablegrams, and just about everything I could put my hands on, to try to then probe and interpret and understand just what was taking place. In doing that, it became clear to me that as far as Churchill was concerned, he wanted to essentially answer three questions, and he wanted, in a sense, to make a unity out of British wartime policy, and those three questions were these: what to do with the Balfour Declaration, what to do with Sykes-Picot, And before all that, what to do with the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. Now, all three of those have their own history, and all three of those continue in a certain way to have a very lively, controversial history all the way down to our own day. For Churchill, in 1921, he wanted to somehow create a unity out of those policies. Now remember, Churchill in 1921 has become colonial secretary after being for a while in the political wilderness. He's just come back from that. He's been made Secretary of War and Air. And in late 1920, Lloyd George decides that, for various reasons, Churchill would do better elsewhere. And I go into some of these reasons in the book. The elsewhere is the Colonial Office. So they meet over the new year 1921. He listens to Lloyd George, and this being Churchill, Lloyd George was doing more of the listening than Churchill was. And the upshot was that Churchill agreed to go to the Colonial Office on one condition, that he be allowed to establish within the Colonial Office a Middle East department, kind of subunit within the Colonial Office. Now, the term Middle East is only just beginning to be used at this particular point in time. And for Churchill, the first thing he wanted to do at the Colonial Office was plunge into the question of the post-war settlement of the Middle East, which, based on what had happened in Paris in 1919, at San Remo in 1920, was still unresolved. Churchill believed that the promises made, particularly the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, was a debt of honor owed by the British. So Lloyd George said, yes, come aboard, set up your Middle East department. Others didn't think it was such a good idea. Lord Curzon, for one, thought it was a very bad idea. He always thought Churchill was empire building and so forth. But nonetheless, it was allowed to go through. And the first person Churchill tapped to be his chief advisor was Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence. Now, you could spend a long time talking about T.E. Lawrence. In fact, I went to Dorset 2 days ago, got thoroughly soaked, but went to the cottage and Morton Cemetery and so forth. In 1921, Lawrence is probably the most famous man in the world, and I don't exaggerate. Something like 4 million tickets had been purchased over the preceding couple of years to go to Lowell Thomas's lantern slide show, as it was called in those days. To give you some sense of what that means, he was drawing crowds the way Taylor Swift has been drawing crowds, with many fewer people to draw upon also. So Lawrence is spectacularly well known. By 1921, he doesn't want to be well known. He believes himself to be a failure. He believes himself to be a failure because the Arab revolt has not yielded what he wanted it to yield. His mother said that after he came home from the Paris Peace Conference, he would sit almost in a state of catatonia in the kitchen of their house in Oxford and look at the floor for hours on end. But he's never stopped advocating for the Arabs. He's been in the papers, he writes in the Times, he writes elsewhere. So Churchill takes a stab. And in those days, Lawrence is writing Seven Pillars of Wisdom, his memoir of the revolt. And he's literally living about a 5-minute walk from the War Office, just beyond Westminster Abbey, 14 Barton Street in a garret owned by the famous architect Herbert Baker. So Churchill asks him to come to the War Office. And Lawrence agrees, and off he goes. And Churchill lays out his case, and he tells him, this is what I'm trying to do. These are the three policies. I'm going to try to make sense of them. Will you help me? And Lawrence is at first not quite sure. He's done with war, as it were. He's never experienced diplomacy, doesn't really want to, doesn't like wearing uniforms, all the sorts of things that you can read about with Lawrence. Not sure about Churchill, but he still sees the possibility of making right what hadn't gone right. So he signs on. He's given a substantial salary, and he signs on for a year. And he's immediately put together with some others in this new Middle East department, and they start planning this conference. And they plan it in about 2 months. They put it all together very quickly. It's all organized, and off they go. They're met in Egypt by this man, General Allenby, Lord Allenby, the Bull. The Bull. The Bull is High Commissioner. He's been there for a few years. He had, of course, commanded the Palestine campaign. He has his own issues to deal with in Egypt, which I won't get into. There he is coming into Jerusalem in December of 1917, and so forth. There's Lawrence back in 1917 also, and Damascus at the very end of the war. Percy Cox, Bell, Ibn Saad. So maybe I'll just finish with this, and then we can move to Sir John. When Lawrence comes aboard, he comes aboard wanting to achieve what he could not achieve at Paris. He went to Paris, remember, as Faisal's chief advisor. He now sees a second opportunity to achieve an Arab state or Arab states. Churchill wants to go in that direction. People on the ground in Baghdad, like Gertrude Bell and Percy Cox, want to go in that direction. Allenby wants to go in that direction. Most of the people that will gather at Cairo in March of 1921, there's about 40 of them, most of them want to go in that direction also. So when they all end up at the same hotel, this luxurious hotel on the Nile River in central Cairo, that's the first, and it's certainly from the standpoint of Lawrence, the first thing that he wanted to achieve. The Cairo Conference will do several other things. It will push and probe and move in several other directions, and I think Sir John is probably going to ask some questions and take my remarks in that direction. But I think that's enough in terms of introductions. This was from a trip I took about 5 years ago, which you can see why Lawrence was attracted to the area. And there's a very bad attempt at trying to be Lawrence for a moment. Bad hat or scarf or something. Anyway, so I'll turn things over to Sir John and Shamshir. There we go.
Thank you very much, Professor. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep.
Good. Okay. I'm sitting in Tehran with behind me a photograph of Edith Dulham, the formidable English woman who became the great advocate of Albanian independence in the 1920s and 1930s. Just a reminder that Gertrude Bell was not alone in being a formidable architect of British imperial policy in this period. There was, of course, Rebecca West a little later as well. And earlier this week, I was in Jordan, and I can tell you, which you already know, that the issues of the 1921 Cairo Conference are still alive and kicking in the modern Middle East. Issues of borders, sectarianism, the relationship between religions, and so forth. And that was a great introduction to the book. If anybody in the audience hasn't read the book, I heartily recommend it, because it is, as you said, a work of what I consider proper history, thinking about why people did what they did in their own terms, and the terms of their own time, and then drawing some conclusions from that. And also, I have to say, without embarrassing you, I may embarrass you, but I don't mean to. It's beautifully written. I really enjoyed reading it, which is not something I can say for every book I read on the Middle East or North Africa, as Ali will know. Can I start by asking? I mean, this issue of imperial history, particularly in the Middle East, this issue of the formation, as it were, of the modern state system in the Middle East, is of course a highly contested topic in all sorts of different ways, perhaps more so now than ever. When you were writing the book, or when you thought about writing the book, did you have preconceptions about about the Cairo Conference and its results? And did your views change as you wrote the book?
Yes, thanks, Sir John. My preconceptions were that, like most people who had read about it, I think, and there are lots and lots of books. I think of the David Fromkin book, Chris Catherwood, all kinds of books. That the conference was variously described as political theater, as Winston's folly, as hot air and aeroplanes. My understanding, based on reading those sorts of interpretations of the conference, was that it was essentially a kind of political stunt, unserious. And I would have left it there, I think, actually, but I had by that point in time worked on two biographies. I had written a biography of Kitchener, Lord Kitchener, and I followed that up with a biography of Lord Allenby. So I had spent a fair bit of time poking around the archives and reading about what they did over a long period of time, especially Kitchener. I mean, Kitchener was a surveyor in Ottoman Palestine in the 1880s. So I began with those two, and particularly with Allenby, I began to think about what went on in 1921 that made it so important, and here 100 years later we continue to think about it. And I wasn't satisfied with most of the answers I was getting in the existing literature. I have to say I was also, like many people, impressed with Margaret Macmillan's Paris 1919 as a way of trying to really unearth the toing and froing of those 6 months in Paris. And then also, some of you will have come across this book. It's called The Guardians by Susan Peterson. Sort of a Canadian triumvirate, actually. Peterson's a Canadian, Macmillan's a Canadian. I'm the only one who actually lives in Canada, but nonetheless, that often happens. But in any event, those two books pulled me in a way that I had not been pulled in before, in terms of trying to understand the conference itself. Yeah.
You talk about, at various points in the book, and you mentioned it, the Hussein McMahon correspondence, and you talk about Elie Kaddouri in the final chapter. And Elie Kaddouri's view of the matter, of course, his famously waspish and acerbic, the Chatham House version, and his essay on the Hussein McMahon correspondence in particular, sets out a particular view of this. And I haven't read them for some time, but my recollection of them is basically that he thought that everybody was lying to everybody else, and making promises under the pressure of conflict, and in the case of the Sherifian family in Mecca, on the basis of an unfounded belief that they represented a pan-Arab movement, which actually they didn't. Do you think Kaddouri? Do you think he had a point? Do you think he had a point? And why do you think Churchill, in particular, felt so committed to the idea of delivering on what he believed to be the promises contained in the say in the command correspondence in particular, but more generally in terms of the way in which we had committed ourselves to the so-called Arab revolt.
Yeah, Kaduri had a point. People weren't lying to one another. I think in that sense he was extreme. But for the British, and I've been recently working on the life of Sir Ronald Storrs, the first British governor of Jerusalem. But before all of that, he was in Cairo. He'd gone out in 1904. Actually, had a long run in Cairo, and in terms of where this begins, the correspondence and the privileging of the Hashemites and so forth. That's a very complicated story because the British, in another way, had been privileging Ibn Saud. And so I think by 1915, as far as the British were concerned, they thought to a large extent that Hussein and the Hashemites were going to make a better potential partner than Saud. There's a division in the Arab Bureau, there's a division in the Foreign Office, there's a division in the Colonial Office. Remember, Sir Percy Cox has a long, who's at this point in Baghdad, but Sir Percy Cox has had a long relationship with Saud, all the way back to the Treaty of Darien in 1915, and that will carry through. So I think by the time the correspondence begins in 1915, and that is something that is really triggered by Kitchener. It's Kitchener who wants to probe the possibilities in 1915 and 1916. And I think part of the reason for Kitchener, and this comes out in Storrs' correspondence, is that the potential, in their view, for Hussein to be a better partner of the British is clearer than Saud at that point. And that cleavage will continue right the way through this period. And as you know, with St. John Philby and so forth, that cleavage will become quite stark. Yeah.
Yes. So, when I look at the Cairo Conference, I mean, there are these other players involved at the time. Egypt, of course, is a major. It's a site of the Cairo Conference, but the British, we have our own aims and problems in Egypt, going back to 1870, to the Arabi Revolt, and then of course in 1919 you get the Zaghloul with the rise of the Wafd, and then you get Allenby's declaration of 1920, whatever it was, 22, on the constitutional issue. And this, I mean, Egypt was always seen as the centre of the British imperial presence in the Middle East. The Gulf itself, which is very distant, but that was actually governed from India. That was a part of the extended Raj. And the other major actor at this time, as you say, is Abdulaziz Ibn Saud. He is championed particularly by Captain Shakespeare, who dies at the Battle of Sybilla in whenever it is, 1915, 1916, January, anyway, futilely waving his service revolver in the direction of advancing tribesmen. But in retrospect, Shakespeare was right, wasn't he? The bet we should have made, and we eventually did make, because we accepted Abdulaziz's essential driving out of the Sherifian family from Mecca, the annexation of the Hejaz, and indeed then supported Abdulaziz for a decade or so, from the late 1920s. How do we reconcile those two things? I mean, you talk about splits in the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office and so forth. I mean, it does seem to me to be, and if you look at the way in which borders, I mean, I've just been in Jordan, and the Jordanians still talk about, you know, why was that large slice taken out of the territory in what is now Al Jawf in Saudi Arabia, between Iraq and Jordan. And of course, a lot of those borders were the product not simply of British imperial fiat, but were also part of negotiations which involved people like Abdulaziz and Abdullah in Transjordan, and indeed in Iraq later on between the Turks, between Ataturk and King Faisal. So the Cairo Conference is a large part of some of this, but it's not the whole story.
I think for Saud, I think the problem for the British is that they thought they were having one kind of partner with the Hashemites, and they got another.
Yes.
And in 1921, 1922, after the conference, Lawrence is sent on a diplomatic mission. He described himself as a shuttlecock at this point. He'd become a kind of informal diplomat. And he's flying to Jordan, and he's flying to Arabia, and he's going back to London. And one of the things that he attempts to do is negotiate a treaty, an Anglo-Hashemite treaty. So by this point in time, Transjordan is under the emirship of Abdullah, one of Hussein's sons. Iraq is under the kingship of Faisal. But the Sharif himself, Hussein, is unhappy with all of this. What he seemed to want is, in fact, the restoration of the caliphate, and he says so. And in negotiations with Lawrence, it becomes clear to Lawrence that the whole business is potentially going to be a fiasco. And in fact, he's not able to achieve a signed treaty. Abdullah ends up signing it, but Hussein doesn't. And at that point, it would seem that it's only a matter of time before Hussein is not only squeezed out by the British, but Saud, as you mentioned a few moments ago, will topple him and the Hashemites, and Western Arabia, the Hejaz, will come under the control of the Saudis. And then it goes from there, as you know. I mean, the kingship in 1932 and so forth. So Hussein himself comes to a sad end. He's sent off in exile to Ceylon. But I think in 1922 it became clear to the British that, in a sense, they'd backed the wrong horse, as it were. But earlier, it seemed that the Hashemites were the right one. And you mentioned Shakespeare, Captain Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, the other one, without the E at the end. That William Shakespeare has been compared to sort of the Saud version of Lawrence. And if he hadn't been killed in battle, that maybe things would have turned out quite differently. St. John Philby thought that absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare had an extraordinarily distinguished career as a military officer, and also in the Indian civil service.
Yeah, and he's almost forgotten now.
Well, a friend of mine, a former colleague of mine, Alan Dillon, wrote a decent book about Shakespeare about 3 years ago, using his journals. I mean, one of the interesting things that always seemed to me, actually, about Abdulaziz is that he did want a territorially bounded state, which was something that the first Saudi state had not really been. The first Saudi state collapses in the 1810s because it seeks to extend its raiding suzerainty into southern Iraq, and indeed even further afield, knowing no boundaries. Perhaps Abdulaziz had learned the lessons of that, and of also the collapse of the second Saudi state in the mid to late 19th century because of family feuding, which is an interesting thing to reflect on when we think about what sort of state Saudi Arabia is today. And he was actually offered. I mean, the various people made him the offer of the caliphate after the abolition of the caliphates by Ataturk in 24, and he always refused it. It's always been interesting to me that he actually accepted the title of king in 32, or created the title of king after having been sultan and Najd. Just going back to Jordan and Iraq, I mean, the two Hashemite kingdoms that were created. I mean, leaving aside the episode in Syria. And you talk about this in your final chapter. One worked very well, Jordan, which you might not have predicted in the 1920s, and the other didn't. I mean, some of that may be because Faisal died young. But why do you think? Do you have any views about why that might have happened? Why the difference?
Yeah, that's a big one. Let's start, I think, with scale. So scale is much different. I mean, Jordan as a political entity at the beginning is a very small operation. I mean, it has a population of maybe 200,000. Yeah. So questions of scale are much different than in Iraq, where the population in the early 1920s is 3 to 4 million. Abdullah, I think, surprised everybody in that he was able to govern in a quite tempered way. I mean, Lawrence didn't think very much of him. Churchill was less than impressed. He underwhelmed everybody, but Lawrence came to the opinion that Abdullah's real gifts were not on the battlefield, were not in strategizing about a pan-Arabian state. They were, in fact, in governance. He relied heavily on the British. Lawrence talks about flying airplanes, old Handley Page bombers down to Abdullah at the beginning, and this was a sign that the British would support the new regime. So partly it's that. You mentioned Faisal's early death, and he died at 48, spent, it would seem, exhausted. But part of the problem there was the succession. So he was succeeded essentially by children and youth, by Ghazi, then by Faisal. The Second World War and the rise of Gailani and so forth was terribly problematic for the Iraqi state. Because by 1930, I mean, the British and the Iraqis signed a treaty in 1922. Yeah. They signed another one in 1930. What Gertrude Bell in particular had hoped for, and remember she dies in 1926, essentially heartbroken in a sense that she's no longer at the center of the action. She dies in Baghdad. You can visit her grave today. But by 1930, Iraq has sort of solidified, certainly constitutionally solidified, and I think if one of the counterfactuals of history, if Faisal had lived beyond 1933, I think Iraq would have absolutely avoided what happened in the Second World War, the connections with fascist regimes, particularly Germany. I mean, Germany is running Nazi operatives through Iraq in 1941. There's a month-long war, as it were, as it's been called, between the British and the Iraqis in May of 1941. So all of this, I think, would in the end undermine the state's ability to continue to progress. And then, of course, post-war and leading right down to 1958 and the revolution. Meanwhile, in Jordan, the Hashemite dynasty continues to rule. The British stay invested in the country until 1946. David Fieldhouse, who was a long time here at Jesus College, he was asked this question once, and he said, well, it was all about the Arab Legion. It's all about the army. The army kept the regime in place. Yes. And it could do that in an easier, more direct way in Jordan on a smaller scale again than could be done in Iraq.
Yes, you talk about the Arab Legion again in your book. It's an interesting issue, particularly when you look at it in the light of what happened in Iraq in the 1930s. So Faisal and the British have a slight falling out in the 1920s over the creation of the Iraqi army and the size of the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army is formed. You have what is probably the first military coup in the Middle East in 1935. Bakr Sidki, who has become the commander, who is himself a Kurd and a former Ottoman officer, who then proceeds to massacre large numbers of Assyrians and a certain number of Shia as well. And it's actually one of those massacres that startles Raphael Lemkin in the mid-1930s into thinking about genocide. There was a famous Iraqi sociologist, the late Ali al-Wardi, who wrote a multi-volume study of Iraqi. It's an anecdotal sociology of Iraq, but he talks in that about the duality of the Iraqi political personality. He means, of course, Shia, Sunni, Kurd, Arab, Christian, Muslim, and so forth. And there's a whole range of different. I think it's multiple in a way that actually Jordan wasn't. Jordan was far more homogeneous. It was much smaller. It didn't have the possession of the two great Shia shrine cities in the north, in the south. So it didn't have the shrine economy that you had in southern Iraq. And it didn't, of course, have the Kurdish issue. I want to come back to the Kurdish issue in a minute, because that also seems to me interesting, and I will be in Kurdistan in a month's time. But these fault lines, they occur elsewhere. And I'm thinking particularly of what became Palestine, so Mandate Palestine. And you look at what happened in the 1920s with the growth of Jewish immigration, with the confrontation over the Western Wall, the Nabi Musa disturbances, and indeed in 1921 the Hebron massacres. So these are political, but there's also a sectarian element to it, and they are a reflection in some way of British imperial policy. As to a certain extent, you could argue some of these things in Iraq were, with the British mustering of Assyrians into military levies during the First World War and afterwards. Do you think these things? So we talk about the Cairo as I suppose an attempt to create a regional state system based on the idea of the nation state. Was that delusory? I mean, do you think the nation state? I mean, and this is an argument, of course, that many still make in the region. It's an argument Islamists make all the time. It's an argument that Hassan al-Banna made from 1928 onwards with the Muslim Brotherhood. Was all this foreseeable? And was there a different way of making this, of doing this?
Yeah, another great counterfactual. I think, well, the short answer is no, but it's no, I think, because in 1919 at Paris, the New World Order that was so loftily advocated made state building normative and indispensable. And I think for any nation, for any ethnicity who wanted to operate in the post-war world, the nation state needed to be the vehicle. And clearly, some parts of the world were further along the road to nation statehood than others, and nation states everywhere were a work in progress. Remember, universal election practices and so forth are still, in some places in the West, a generation away from taking place. So the idea that mass nationalism, the nation state, national unity, representative government, self-determination, the rights of small states, you almost sound like Gladstone here or something, but that I think was inescapable. And I think in Iraq, in Jordan, as jejune as that might have been, or as in Kuwait as that might have been, that was the aspiration.
Yes.
Faisal was clearly in the vanguard of that. That's what he wanted. I mean, he complained later, there's no Iraq, right? There's no Iraq. And the idea was that where are the Iraqis? Right? That was his complaint. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, this issue of reconciling the nation state with ethnicity or with confessionalism, or with pluralism seems to me still to be something that bedevils the Middle East. And of course, most nation states in the region, certainly after 1945, in their constitutional dispensations, classify themselves as Arab and Muslim. Lebanon is probably the one exception, but that's an exception for very, very specific reasons, and hasn't resulted and the consociationalism it produced hasn't actually resulted in a successful, sustainable state. But I wanted to ask you about the Kurds. I mean, you talk about this issue in the book. And I was very struck with your recounting of Gertrude Bell as telling Lawrence that he was an imp for advocating with Major Noel, who is still remembered in Kurdistan, for Kurdistan independence and Kurdish statehood. I mean, this has been an issue that has bedeviled the Kurdish national movement since the 1920s. They've only really had a state once, and that was the Mahabad Republic in 1945, which only really happened because the Russians supported it. And then when the Russians withdrew their support because of their relationship with Iran, and I see Ali is trying to stay out of the picture.
I'm biding my time, John. I'll have my moment.
And then they were crushed. And I used to have these conversations all the time when I used to go to people when I was ambassador in Baghdad. And the Kurds, of course, will still say, that they were betrayed after Sèvres. The promises that they think were made them. And my argument was that it was a function of power. That in the end, neither Iraq nor Turkey nor Iran nor indeed Syria would countenance an independent Kurdish state. Do you think a Kurdish state was possible?
No. No. And it's the only time really at the conference that there was a division behind closed doors. Churchill went thinking that a Kurdish state was possible and that it should come into existence. And so did the Middle East Department. On the ground, Cox and Bell were diametrically opposed. And I don't think, from what I've read, that Churchill understood that. So in committee, because the conference is divided into several committees, political and military, and sometimes they would cross over. And they worked pretty hard, this conference. 50 or 60 sessions. They weren't just swanning around Cairo. They actually got down to work. And in that particular committee meeting, which was given over to the Kurdish question, and it reads, and later, beyond the transcript of the meeting, it reads as if Churchill thought that because he and the members of the Middle East Department were of one view on this, that the others would round into form. And they all found out that that was not the case. And Bell spoke fiercely about it, and she could be fierce. Remarkable person, Gertrude Bell. And Cox was the same. He was gentler. He was a professional diplomat. He was gentler about it. And Lawrence was essentially batted down by Bell. You know, the imp comment, and he turns red, and he's embarrassed, and so forth. And they tried to cool the temperature. And Bell said, well, maybe we should try to put this to a vote, to a plebiscite, to see what the Kurdish people want themselves. Again, a sort of nod to the 1919 principle and so forth. And at the end of the day, Churchill lost. A year or so ago, I was giving a talk, and the high representative of the, you'd know the Kurdish regional government, came out to the talk, and he asked essentially the same question, and I hope I didn't give exactly the same answer, but you end up sort of plagiarizing yourself after a while. But yes, as you say, it's a live question. The one person who was brought in for the meeting, and you mentioned his name in passing, Noel, Major Noel, and he's an interesting sort of furtive spy character. He's not even given a title in the record of the conference. Everyone else was a service chief or colonial office, and his name just Major Edward Noel, full stop. Well, and this is the only place that he had a role at all. But he came in and said what was really needed, and this goes to your point about power politics, what is really needed is a kind of Kurdish buffer state. Now, whatever that was going to mean, it probably wasn't going to mean what Kurds themselves might want, but it would have been in the service of sort of British geostrategic interests. But Noel suffered the same fate on that day. Yeah.
I've always liked the description. I can't remember whose it was. Actually, Percy Cox was a man who was silent in 5 languages, which is not something you could have said about Gertrude Bell, or indeed Ronald Strauss. One final question before handing over to Ali for questions, and I'm sure there'll be lots, which is about Sykes-Picot. And this, of course, regularly comes up in discussions in the region. It was a major slogan of the Islamic State, of course, after 2015, when they said they were destroying Sykes-Picot. I mean, my understanding, well, you go back, I mean, I don't think Sykes-Picot was ever implemented. What was implemented was something rather different. But what do you think do you think there was any relationship between the Sykes-Picot and the Cairo Conference?
Yeah, in 2 ways, I would say. One is that for Churchill and the others at the conference, Sykes-Picot had laid the groundwork for what they eventually decided they wanted to do. But the big change, I think, and this was in the fall of 1918, was in November of 1918, the British and the French released a declaration, the Anglo-French Declaration it was called. And the declaration essentially disabled Sykes-Picot. It transcended Sykes-Picot. After 1918, while Sykes-Picot was continually brought up as being sort of the blueprint for what the great powers were going to do in the Middle East, no, it really was the Anglo-French Declaration that becomes operational, and both Picot and Sykes themselves were regarded by a whole range of people in the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office and in Egypt and so forth as unserious, to say the least. Everyone hated Picot. Everyone hated Sykes. Lawrence loathed him. Lawrence loathed Sykes. And then sadly, of course, Sykes dies of the Spanish influenza in the midst of the Paris Peace Conference. And Picot, at the very beginning, Picot arrives in Jerusalem early in 1918, and Allenby is there and will remain there for another year. And Picot is trying to worm his way into civil governance in Palestine, and Allenby can't stand this, and in fact, Lawrence tells a wonderful anecdote about a group of them standing there while Picot was advocating to Allenby. And they were waiting for Allenby to do what he usually did, which was to sort of stick out his chin, and smoke would come out of his ears, and the person would be dismissed. And that's exactly what happened to Picot. And Lawrence writes how their mouths gaped with their chicken sandwiches hanging from their lips as Picot got the dressing down of his life. So no, by the fall of 1918, whatever Sykes-Picot meant in real terms was already beginning to be superseded. Yeah. But it's had an unbelievably long afterlife, as you say.
It's astonishing. It's astonishing. Everywhere you go, it's about Sykes-Picot. And I just add that there was, of course, a Russian dimension to Sykes-Picot as well.
There was.
Yeah. That's how I know.
Right.
Never forget the Russians. Yeah.
Never forget the Russians. Okay. On that note, I'll hand over to Ali.
Thank you, and thank you, Brad. Thank you, John, for a splendid conversation. It now falls to me, because we do a lot of multitasking at the Centre for Geopolitics, and we're now moving away from the virtual to the real, and to invite questions from the audience. So all I would need from you is basically, if you have a question, which I hope you have several, is to introduce yourself and ask your question in as concise and clear way as you can. And it looks like, well, that's a bit of a, I have to say that's a bit of a con, but it looks like,
I have good reason for asking the question.
okay, so the director is now,
For which I apologise.
okay.
But, I know a little bit about Cairo, the Cairo Conference, not very much, but it would be, I think, helpful for the audience to have a little bit more on what was actually decided there or not decided, just as background. And the second question is to do with the definition of the Middle East. You said that the Middle East was a sort of new concept, and so what was actually included in the so-called official mind at that time as part of the Middle East, and what wasn't?
Of course, Brendan didn't introduce himself, but I think we all know who he is, so that's okay. So why don't you take that, and then I've got two on the front here as well. But
no, certainly, and I probably should have sketched in a little bit more of that at the beginning. So the 10 days at Cairo, essentially what was decided was one big thing, that the British were going to monarchize Faisal, one of the sons of Sharif Hussein, to be the new king of Iraq. Now, the the small backstory to that, small in the sense of there's very little time to go beyond that, is for a brief period of time, down to the summer of 1920, Faisal had been king of Syria, and he'd been deposed by the French. So in the back and forth of diplomatic relations between the British and the French, and in the world of mandatory politics coming out of Paris, the French mandate for Syria was going to happen in the same way that the British mandate for Mesopotamia or Iraq was going to happen. There was a quid pro quo there, which would be solidified over a couple of years. So the British, and when I say the British, I mean specifically Churchill and Lawrence, and a few other people at the Middle East Department, and then Gertrude Bell, and Cox, Sir Percy Cox, and Faisal himself, decided that the way forward in Iraq, the way forward to create an Arab state, was to make him king. So that was the essential business of Cairo. Now, the other piece of it, because the Cairo Conference is really the Cairo-Jerusalem Conference, but that's not a very good title. But the last bit, the addendum to the Cairo Conference, was the creation of a second Arab state in Jordan, or Transjordan, as it was called in those days. So when it ended in Cairo, Churchill and Lawrence got on a train and went up to Jerusalem. And Lawrence went over across the Jordan River and brought Abdullah back to Jerusalem for a head-to-head conversation with Churchill. And the message that Churchill was delivering to him was that that we will make you king of Jordan as we have made your brother king of Iraq. And the quid pro quo of that is that the Balfour Declaration will stand. So there will be a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine, and the quid pro quo for that is Transjordan. Now, Churchill was always of the opinion that the Balfour Declaration was a double promise. It was a double promise that there would be a national homeland, and this would be debated later. Is it the maximum option of statehood? Is it the minimum option of a homeland? These are all debatable things historically. But he said the double promise was this: there will be a national homeland for the Jews. And the whole history of international Zionism and so forth is a long one, all the way back to the 19th century. It culminates in the period of the war. Other places than Palestine are offered. Uganda was offered. Saskatchewan in Western Canada. That would be news to everyone I know in Saskatchewan. But in any event, the double promise was the national homeland, but the national homeland would be part of an Arab state. Remember too that Turkish Palestine was much bigger, took in modern Jordan essentially, and the Zionist organization, Weizmann in particular, was really upset that Palestine was being severed in this way. But Faisal was in agreement. Abdullah, I think, couldn't quite believe that he was going to be emir and then king. What luck, in his view, I think. But that's essentially what the Cairo Conference was called to decide. The use of the term Middle East, it was essentially a turn-of-the-century term. Churchill didn't invent the term, but he was the first to use it in in a broad way and the first to really popularize that language. Essentially, the Middle East was comprised of the former territories of the Ottoman Empire, the various vilayets of the Ottoman Empire around the Mediterranean basin. Yeah.
Gentleman there.
Zain, I'm from Faculty Divinity. So my question, am I to understand that Sykes-Picot didn't have consequences in the region?
It clearly had consequences. Sykes-Picot, from the standpoint of Sykes and Picot themselves, was a much bigger thing in their minds than it ever became in terms of the British government. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't binding. What really becomes the Anglo-French view is laid down in Paris, and Paris introduces the mandate system. And I think one of the ways to understand the mandate system is that it's a kind of successor, a more politically acceptable successor to territorial empire. That's certainly what U.S. President Wilson thought. And the great powers themselves are coming round to that point of view. So what really matters is that more than Sykes-Picot. Yeah.
Faisal Kandil, I'm a historical sociologist. So I think my question is, I think you're taking a very laudable approach to bring these historical actors into life and what they did, giving them some agency. So I think my question is, do you think that the actors could have designed what eventually became the modern Middle East in a slightly different or a better way, or were there irreconcilable differences, fundamental, differences between the Anglo-French understandings, the promise to the Hashemites, the Saudis afterwards, Balfour Declaration? No one could have come up with a better design.
Yeah.
The Americans tried in 2003.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is interesting is President Wilson, and the Americans have their own interests now, and oil isn't quite at the center of things yet, but it will be soon enough, but it not quite yet. And Wilson is wanting to have his ideas actualized in some way. So one of the things that comes about is in Syria, there is a commission set out to try to understand what Syrians themselves want. So it's sort of a proto-democratic approach. And the name of it was the King Crane Commission, named for two of the American commissioners who did this. And the King Crane Commission will not figure very importantly because it's essentially put on a shelf. But it made an attempt to determine what the Syrians themselves wanted coming out of the war, as a kind of blueprint for what other Arabs wanted. And the commission showed that what the Syrians wanted was a state of their own, of course, in accordance with what the League of Nations and what the Paris Peace Conference said was constituent of the New World Order. Now, the problem with that is that the world wasn't quite ready for a New World Order, because the principle of small statehood and self-determination and so forth that had formed part of the 14 points and, of Wilson. The world of imperial realpolitik wasn't ready for that. But what it was ready for was this intermediate step of the mandatory system. So in that sense, it became a kind of halfway house that was understood to be leading somewhere. I mean, when Bell is in Iraq, she's fierce about Iraqi independence. That's what she wants. But she's also concerned that independence just can't be automatic. In a sense, it has to be sort of shepherded within the real world of realpolitik. She wrote this massive memorandum that circulated in Parliament in 1920 about the future of Iraq. And of course, this being 1920, no one could believe that it had been written by a woman and all of this sort of thing. And Bell just thinks this is ridiculous because there's no one in Britain who knows more about Iraq than Gertrude Bell. And in 1920 and 1921, she has certain ideas that Iraq will get there, but only through this mandatory system, because the mandatory system is the only way that Paris and the great powers can understand the new world. So it's a bit of give and take. Lawrence wasn't so concerned about Iraq, except he wanted to see Faisal finally get his due. I mentioned earlier that Lawrence sort of ends the war in the Slough of Despond. He comes back at the end of 1921 into 1922, and he's absolutely satisfied. You can read a lot about Lawrence and Lawrence thinking that he lived a dissatisfied life when it came to the Middle East after 1922. It's not true. It's not true. He said, we have come out of the Middle East with clean hands. He thought, for example, that Churchill was a brilliant statesman. And Churchill was trying to pull Lawrence back into governmental duty all the way through the 1920s into the 1930s. Lawrence wanted none of it. He wasn't even very interested in the Middle East after 1922, Lawrence. He didn't give over much time to thinking about it, apart from the book. So there are some substantive differences of opinion about how statehood can be achieved, but the end result, most of the actors that turn up in this book are on the same page, except for one of the great exceptions, as came up earlier, was the question of the Kurds. Yeah.
Muhammad Qubadi, I'm from Yemen. I'm a former professor of surgery in Yemen, but later became an ambassador as well as a minister for tourism and information sometime. I'm trying to drag you actually. Sir John took you to the northeast part of the Middle East, to Turkestan. I'm trying to get you to something which is quite topical and perhaps it has not been touched, to Yemen. I just wondered, at that time, because the British were in Aden, and there was the Aden Protectorate, and at the same time, in 1921, actually from 1917 to 1923, the British were also in Hodeidah, the port, which is now creating a lot of trouble. And at that time, did they actually, the British, because they didn't help in the, acknowledging Imam Yahya as the Imam or King of Yemen, because I believe that the conference outcomes in Cairo didn't only agree on the creation of Transjordan and Iraq, but also they actually confirmed that Saud will be the Sultan of Najd and Sharif Hussein will continue to be the king of Saudi Arabia, of Hijaz. So did they actually, because we think, I've been reading through this, that we have lost a chance at that time, because the British at that time thought they could, sort of unify Yemen apart from Aden, the colony itself. did that come into sort of discussions in the conference?
It did. It did. It didn't figure very prominently because at that point in time, for the British, Aden was of supreme importance. So most of the discussion when it came to that particular question was about Aden. One of the things that I talk about in the book that hasn't come up is that in part to achieve cooperation, the British subsidized various of the rulers and leaders. So Saud, for example, I think he was getting about £10,000 a month and so forth. So the Idrisi in the south, I think it was £1,000 a month. So it depended on who you were and where you were and the relative importance of the territory and so forth. But in general, no, Yemen is not of great importance outside of Aden. Outside of Aden, yeah.
Thank you very much. James Watt, former ambassador to Cairo, I can claim to have slept in Allenby's bed. I think my question's partly been covered already since I first put my hand up. But I was wondering about the international dimension to the Cairo Conference, and you mentioned Foucault getting a blessing down from Allenby. Was there much lobbying by the French, by the Americans, by anybody else? Or was this very much a sort of closed British imperial conclave which they worked out for themselves?
The latter. I mean, it was very much a British event. 39 delegates, the so-called 40 thieves. Someone said that, and Churchill chuckled. So in that sense, it's tiny. It's tiny. I mean, from the standpoint of big international conferences, all the way back into the 19th century, tiny. One of the things that was important, however, to Cox and Bell in particular, was that there be at least some representation from the Iraqi government, as it then was. So the preponderant number of people there were service chiefs. And this didn't come up in our talk, but one of the motivations for Churchill is the Iraqi rebellion of 1920. Remember, the British ultimately conquer Iraq in 1917 after the awful battle at Kut in 1915 and 1916, and all of that is over. The British drive out the Ottomans in 1917. By 1920, Iraqis are wondering whether they were better off under the Turks, only because there was so much fluidity and questions about the impact of Paris and so forth. So the British were spending something like £20 million a year at that point on troops and ordnance and so forth. So one of the motivations for Churchill is to change that. Right? He's a government minister. It's always about economizing. So one of the things he wants to do is change that. At the same time, he's motivated by these other features. So there are two members of the Iraqi government, the National Council, who are there. One's an Arab and one's a Jew. The population of Baghdad, the Jewish population of Baghdad in 1921 was about 80,000, which was half the city. It's remarkable. And this patrician character named Sassoon Esquel, Sir Sassoon, is one of the delegates there, and Jafar Pasha is the other, who'd been a leading figure in the Arab revolt. Everyone else British, 38 men, 1 woman, all British. The French and the Americans, the French aren't very interested because they have Syria. The Americans are interested because they're now looking at the Middle East more through the lens of oil. It's not overwhelming yet. Oil won't even be discovered in Iraq till later, and it won't be pumped till the 1930s. Saudi Arabia, that's the late 1930s. Iran's different. But the Americans, Standard Oil in particular, are already in there. And a fellow named Arnold Wilson, he's in the photograph. He and Bell, no. They loathe one another, and he's in the far corner of the photograph, and she's in the front, I think on purpose. But he's already, as it were, gone over to the oil side of the equation at this point in time. But no, from the standpoint of big conferences, it's very much a British geostrategic event. Yeah.
A secret one.
Not secret. No, it wasn't secret. In fact, Churchill spent a fair bit of time leading up to Cairo, disputing with his constituency, particularly the president of his constituency, that this wasn't all a big show. And I read one of his letters, it's about a 5-page letter outlining what they're going to be doing so that the constituency, his constituents, will understand that what's going on in Cairo is important. It's not just Winston Churchill being Winston Churchill. Yeah. But that was a hard reputation to shake. The prize hunter reputation was a hard reputation to shake. I mean, 20 years of that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. You began by mentioning that Churchill's, I'm George, I'm an MPhil candidate in modern British history. You began by mentioning that Churchill had a moral obligation to the Arabs, that Lawrence was happy with the entire treatment by the end of the conference. And my first question is, were there ever any instances in which this moral obligation to the Arabs overrode British conceptions of national interest or imperial interest? Did they sacrifice anything to fulfill this obligation? And my second question was, with regards to petroleum, you mentioned that it wasn't actually of primary concern to the Americans during this period, but in fact the Turkish Petroleum Company was formed before the war. That became the Iraqi Petroleum Company, directly after the war, in which the Americans had an interest. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yes, thanks, George. To the first one, no, but I don't want it to sound like a hard no, that the British were mechanistic and uncaring and it's all realpolitik. These questions and actions are so enmeshed that it's hard to disaggregate them. So Lawrence, for example, is all about the moral obligation. He's all about the moral obligation. He fought alongside the Bedouin for 2 years. He was trying to, as he put it, hustle into shape a new Asia. So he's all about the moral obligation, completely sold on the prospect of an Arab state or states. Churchill, Bell, Percy Cox, there the question becomes more complicated because on one hand, Churchill sees himself as a state builder, a modern state builder. On the other hand, the British Empire is still the biggest thing in the world. I mean, it's only 100 years ago. The principal organizing feature of world politics 100 years ago was empire. That's the way the world operated. And as Sir John mentioned earlier, the fulcrum of British power was always Suez and the lands around Suez. So Churchill has that in mind all the time, all the time. So was anything given up? I'm not, yeah, I don't think I can answer that in any sort of conventional way. It was this constant constructive tension over the moral obligation, which Churchill felt and believed, but in the moment there are these other wider considerations. And yes, I mean the American Standard Oil of New Jersey in particular is already there, and Bell Bell has Bell has a lot of things to say about a lot of people. She has some pointed things to say about American oilmen. I hate the stuff she said. It's detestable. Speaking of oil, not Americans at that point, but so in that sense, yes, you're right. I mean, it's on the horizon, but it's not determinative in the way that we now might think it is popularly. But the Royal Navy had switched to oil. You know, all that whole story with Churchill as First Lord and so forth. Yeah.
My name's Mari, and I'm an undergraduate studying politics. I was wondering, you mentioned earlier about the concept of a halfway house with a mandatory system, and despite Bell's desire for Iraqi independence, the recognition and acknowledgement that wasn't something that could be achieved rapidly or quickly. Do you think in the post-1945 wave of independence movements, there was a missed opportunity there whereby perhaps a slower system whereby the ex-empire could have facilitated independence better than they did?
Yes. Nationalism by 1945 and in the years immediately after the war has become a kind of ideological tsunami. It can't be resisted, and to even want to be a gradualist in this way was virtually impossible. So for the British in the 1940s and especially in the 1950s, Ghana, you may remember, becomes the first African state to become independent in 1957. And then the 1960s is just an onrush. And it all happens really quickly, too quickly for a lot of people in government, both metropolitan government and in local national governments. But nationalism has won the day. In the 1920s, early 1920s, that hadn't quite yet happened in a way. Mass nationalism doesn't have purchase in quite the same way. That said, Gertrude Bell, by 1922, is despairing over the fact that Churchill and Faisal can't agree on a constitution. And part of the problem is Faisal is pushing because he's being pushed internally, and Churchill is resisting because he thinks it's too fast. But nonetheless, they do sign one in 1922, and then another one in 1930. So could it have been better if it had been done slower? There's a lot of scholarship and history on that very question. The Colonial Office had Kenya penned in to be independent in 1975. Well, clearly in the 1960s, 1975 was a million years from now. So no one was willing to wait. The imperative was just too insistent. Yeah.
So I've got one last question, if Nick?
Nicholas Hopton, former British ambassador to Yemen, Qatar, Iran and Libya.
All the best slated.
and it's about the eastern dimension of this that I just wanted to ask. Given the Middle East may have been in Churchill's mind a concept focused on the essentially Arab countries of the former Ottoman Empire, but of course the countries you're talking about are contingent on the rather large, important country Iran to the east and south. Did that aspect get touched on at all? It's also, given that some of the actors you've mentioned, I think I'm right that Percy Cox may have served in Persia earlier in his career. So did it come up at all at the Cairo Conference, the impact on that border, Iraq, Iran, and especially given the upheaval that was incipient in Iran with the end of the Qajar period and the arrival of the Pahlavis, and of course the British had perhaps a little bit to do with that as well around the edges. So did it get considered or discussed in this context?
No, and intentionally not. Churchill decided that two things he didn't want to talk about at Cairo were Egypt and Iran. No. Now the Gulf states, the Trucial states and so forth, Cox had been intimately involved in British affairs there, the 1915 treaty and so forth, Treaty of Darien with Saud. So no, Churchill intentionally wanted to narrow the scope to just solve what he argued were the pressing issues of leftover British policy, direct leftover British policy. Remember, when this is going on, so too is the situation in Ireland. And he also said, I'm not talking about Ireland while I'm in Cairo. I'll do that when I get back to London. So he had all sorts of things on his plate, and the test of the conference was to not stray, as it were, from what he argued was cardinal to the moment. So no.
So thank you very much. I would like to thank you, Brad, for a splendid talk. And John, in Tirana, I can think of other places I would rather be, but you're well. For that wonderful virtual conversation. And thank you to all of you. Thank you for all the organisation, by the way. It's been splendid. I think it's all worked actually pretty well. I mean, all this high-tech stuff, it's all rather good. So thank you all very much for participating. Thank you for the questions. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there are some bottles at the back there that are about to be opened. So that's I think, a very good idea that we can now decamp from our chairs and head backwards. Not far, but we can go back. Thank you very much. So thank you.